My name is Darrel Whitcomb, and on 9/11 I was 53 years old. I was retired from the United States Air Force, where I served 30 years, graduating from the Air Force Academy in 1969, and then 8 years active duty. 3 years of those were in Southeast Asia, flying missions in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. I was subsequently a T-38 instructor pilot. I was a maintenance officer for a bit. I left active duty in 1977, went into the Air Force Reserve, where I served another 22 years, flying A-37s, A-10s, doing staff tours, went to war college. So I had a full career. In the Air Force career ended in 1999 when I retired. And in 1977, when I left active duty, I had been hired by Delta Airlines, and I was pursuing a full airline career with them, which led me to my assignment on 9/11. I was an international Boeing 767 captain with Delta Airlines. I was home that morning, having arrived the evening before. I'd flown a flight over to Stockholm and back, New York, and then had come home. So I was in a little bit of jet lag when I was coming down the stairs that morning. My wife and I lived in Northern Virginia in Fairfax. And I remember my wife saying to me, hey, look at the TV, something weird's going on. And the cameras were on the tower there in New York City. And I asked her what happened. She said an airplane had flown into the building. And I thought that looked very strange because it was a clear, brilliantly beautiful day in New York. How could such a thing happen? And then I said, what kind of airplane? And she said, well, they're saying it's a light twin engine aircraft. And then they zoomed in, and the hole was much bigger than a small twin engine aircraft would make. And then it was at that exact moment that the camera caught the second airplane flying into the other building. And I remember very clearly turning to my wife and saying, this is not an accident. We are being attacked in some form, and our whole lives have just changed. We spent, of course, the rest of the morning watching the events there, and then I remember very clearly a little while later, our house shook, and it was obvious that something had happened locally. And almost immediately, the local news broke in and said, an airplane has hit the State Department. And then about 1 minute later, they said, no, an airplane has hit the Pentagon. And then we began to see the first scenes of what was going on, really only about 15 miles from our house. And of course, the rest of the morning was like that, just riveted to the TV and hearing the news coming in from all over the nation, and then the announcement that our national airspace had been closed. That hit me particularly hard because I had many, many friends that were literally airborne at that moment, flying for Delta all over the United States and Europe, as I was doing. And I just had to wonder what they were doing now with all of those airplanes. And then after a few moments, I remember again that things were happening there in the Washington area, and we were getting intermittent local reports of this and that. And I remember walking out on my back deck just to get some fresh air, and 2 F-16s roared right over the house, which was extremely unusual. But these were apparently aircraft coming out of Andrews Air Force Base, heading up to the northwest for what turned out to be the airplane that was possibly coming in from Pennsylvania. And then we heard about that airplane crashing. And of course, my job again with Delta was to fly these flights over to Europe. And I had another one scheduled in a few days. And so I called Delta and said, hey, what can you tell me? And they said, well, right now, airspace is closed. Nobody's flying, but we're going to try to maintain our schedule as much as we can. And then a couple days later, when I was due to do my next flight, I was notified that flight would not be going. And it was that way for a few more days. And then finally, the airspace started opening back up, but Delta could not return to routine operations because everything was in chaos. And so a couple days later, I was notified that I would not fly another Stockholm flight. My next flight would be to Istanbul, Turkey. And so the airspace had opened up again, and so we were resuming. And so I remember going up to New York to fly that next hop a few days later and arriving. First, I had to fly up from Dulles Airport to JFK for my flight. And of course, the airport security had been ratcheted up tremendously. I mean, there were guards and people walking around with machine guns right inside the airport and dogs and everything else. So I get up to JFK and I sign in for my flight, and I get together with my two first officers for the flight. And my chief pilot walks in and he says, "We want you to go over and talk to the flight attendants that will be flying with you to Istanbul." And I said, "Why?" And he says, "Well, because they're very agitated, they're very concerned, and oh, by the way, we're going to have a lot of high-level security around your airplane because this is our first flight back into Istanbul since the closing, and of course, Turkey is a Muslim nation." Wow, okay, so I go over and I talk to my flight attendants, and half of them are literally crying their eyes out because they are terrified at the idea of going on this flight. And so we had a long talk about everything, got them settled down. And then I remember walking to the gate, and again, guards standing around with machine guns and dogs, and everybody was armed to the teeth. And then I look outside, and on the ramp there are two military-style vehicles with machine guns mounted on top of them that are going to escort us out to the runway for takeoff. Okay, so we did, and everything was ops normal. The flight over was ops normal, but when we then landed in Turkey, it was the same thing. We were met as we taxied in by armed vehicles with machine guns on them up to the terminal where, again, at every corner there was an armed guard it's of some type. And that was the world that we were in at that time. And needless to say, all of the airlines were devastated by this. Everything was completely disrupted, and it took several months before we were able to get our schedules back to some kind of a relative normal, if you will. And then, but that had dramatically affected us. We had to cut back on our flying, which affected all of us. It reduced our schedules. It scrambled our schedules. So we were all dramatically impacted by that. I might add too that on 9/11, as the events that day were unfolding, I immediately thought of my connection still to the Air Force, and so I called our Air Reserve Personnel Center and volunteered to return to active duty, and never got that call, but I did contemplate the possibility of going back and doing military service had I been able to be useful to the Air Force once again. But then we became involved in our combat operations over there, initially in Afghanistan, and then by early 2003, it was obvious that we were making preparations to initiate what became Operation Allied Force. And the airlines, through the Civil Reserve Air Fleet requirement, began being called to provide airlift capability, support capability for our military. And Delta dedicated, I think, 8 aircraft, all Boeing 767s, to fly troops over to the Gulf region. And so initially that flying time, those missions came to the New York base where I was located, and I became one of the several pilots there at Delta Airlines who were then flying 767s full of troops over to the Middle East. And that was probably some of the most interesting and rewarding flying that I ever did. I found out, first of all, that within 50 miles of every one of our major U.S. military bases, Army bases in particular, we had airports with 10,000-foot runways for this very purpose. And so I went into Fort Bliss, Texas. I landed at some big airport, I think Salina, Kansas, to pick up troops from Fort Riley, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and every one of these loads would be soldiers and sailors and Marines, MacDill Air Force Base. I remember I went in there one evening and picked up the entire command team from CENTCOM, Central Command, and flew them over there. And I kept a log of the various individuals that I flew over to the war. It was really kind of a polyglot, active duty units, guard units, reserve units that ended up fighting in the air campaign over there. I remember one group of soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division, Fort Campbell. These were combat engineers, and they were armed to the teeth. And I mean, it's not every day you see people getting on your beautiful Delta Airlines airliner with machine guns and all kinds of the gear that goes with that, and then watching them load the belly with mortars and 50 caliber machine guns and stuff like that. But then it was very heartening to see that our young flight attendants really did everything they could to make the soldiers comfortable and enjoy their flight over there. And I had one group I remember very particularly. They were a Army National Guard unit, I think, from South Dakota, and they were a group of combat engineers, and they were going over for Operation Iraqi Freedom, and told me that this was the first time their unit had been activated like this since World War II. And they were going to go over there to build bridges for the campaign that we were going to apparently run to go up and capture Baghdad. And so I remembered that unit and noticed after that several mentions of them in the news, how they were fantastic at building all these bridges to take all these allow our soldiers to move all the way up to Baghdad. And so that was probably one of the most rewarding things that I did when I was, with my career at Delta Airlines. I mean, that was really good duty. And then we would fly the airplanes primarily from wherever we picked up the soldiers. We would fly them over to Rome, where we kept kind of like a little forward operating location for Delta crews. And then the crews would swap out the airplanes, and then new crews that were staying in Rome would fly the airplanes on down into bases in the Middle East, primarily Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. I went in and out of Kuwait several times. And once the ground campaign started, that got pretty exciting, because when we were landing in the Kuwait airport there, those of us that had some military training, we were all granted interim secret clearances, and we got security intelligence briefs on what was going on around there as we were going into the Kuwaiti airport. And I remember going in one time and seeing down off to the right a Patriot missile battery that was set up there to defend that region. And other crews were in that same position and actually saw the missiles firing, intercepting cruise missiles that were coming in to the Kuwait area there, Kuwait City, where there were military bases and facilities all around us. And of course, we were offloading the soldiers that are going to be fighting in the campaign. So we were right in the thick of it. And another concern that we had was that the Iraqis would use chemical weapons against us in that area. And so we actually had on board our Delta airplanes, we had these chemical suits, and we supposedly that we could put on to protect us. And I never had to don that gear. I had done that in my military training, so I knew what to expect. But for the flight attendants and the uninitiated, that would have been quite a task. But I do believe there was one crew that was on the ground one time when they sounded the alert there at the Kuwaiti airport, and the crews actually had to dress out in all their chem gear, if you can imagine that. And so we played quite a role in those operations over there, and we were also notified at one point that we had a military contingency such that we would introduce troops into Turkey, and that the troops in Turkey would then attack into Iraq from the north. That was subsequently disapproved by the Turkish government, but we put together all the plans to do that and had our routings all set up and everything to fly from Rome and into, I think, 2 major bases in Turkey and offload the troops there, and you know, so that they could form up their units and then attack into northern Iraq. I remember too, we also were told that 2 of our airplanes at Delta were configured to haul wounded troops, medevac type mission, set up with litters and in bunks of beds and everything to bring them out, and that one of the airplanes very specifically had been configured to handle soldiers who'd been contaminated by chemical weapons. They had that one airplane specially set up for that. I never flew that airplane. We never had to fly it, as a matter of fact. That's the good news. But we were prepared to do that. So that was really quite an experience to do that. And of course, we weren't the only airline doing that. We had others, other airlines. I remember seeing Northwest and United and American. They all had airplanes in the Civil Reserve Air Fleet too. And they were utilizing them to haul our troops back and forth. So that was quite an experience, and almost like being back in the military a little bit. And then subsequent to that, I then retired from Delta Airlines in 2003, which was a few years early for me. I wasn't age 60 at the time, but I had to do that because the airlines had been so devastated by the events of 9/11 that Delta Airlines was facing bankruptcy. And for those of us like myself, or senior, our whole contract defined our working conditions, our salaries, in our retirements, and to secure our retirements. Several hundred of us, unfortunately, had to retire early to lock those in. And when that happened, I then took off my Delta uniform and